Okay, welcome back to the BTR Boxing Podcast Network. I'm your host, Sean, and I'm joined, as always, by Lukie for another episode of the BTR Boxing Weekly Show, the new show that we've decided to encapsulate all of the week's action together in one episode, and of course discuss any notable things going on outside of the boxing ring as well. Some big news, I think, in the last week or so that I'm certainly really eager to discuss with yourself, Lukie. And I think we'll probably get into that a little bit later on. But first and foremost, welcome as always. And it's another interesting week of fights coming up as well. And it was an interesting Friday night in the UK to see a passing of the torch moment between Lauren Price and Natasha Jonas. And I said in the preview that I always write Tasha Jonas off, but this is the one time now where it has actually come to pass, where I felt like maybe Lauren Price would have too much for her, and she certainly did. She dominated Natasha Jonas in that fight, and she was very good from bell to bell of the fight, and deservedly becomes a unified champion in the welterweight division now. And for Tasha, she just didn't look as good as she once did. I think age is definitely creeping up on her. I think her reactions and her speed around the ring wasn't as good as what it once was, and I think that's where Lauren Price excelled in this particular fight, and quite rightly got a decision there. So, Lukie, coming to you first and foremost, what do you think of that fight? And I think the question more so for me is, how good is Lauren Price? Will she become undisputed, and can she move up in weight and become a champion in another weight?
I mean, I think that none of us know the answer, right? That reasonable answers are always terrible answers. But since the 2020 Olympics, she's always stood out as like one of the better fighters of that Olympic Games. And women's boxing still to this day is not the deepest in terms of dynamics. So I think that she has a very good chance at being undisputed at some point. Now, the big question in the room is she beats Natasha Jonas. Now, Michaela Mayer and Sandy Ryan are fighting. Those are really good fighters. And that's, in my opinion, another leap. I thought Mayer beat Jonas. So now you're going to like a more in their prime veteran champion, which is a test I don't think she's faced at that level yet. So I'm not sure how she handles that. I think she's one of the most exciting young champions, and she's going to carry women's boxing. Like, what are we in the third generation yeah, I think third generation since the Olympics adapted women's boxing. So she's probably going to be one of the biggest marquee names going forward to that. And there's tons of potential. But I think what's also exciting is it's not unfathomable that she could lose, which I think builds to some intrigue.
I'm looking forward to seeing where her career goes. I think based on what I've seen out of Sandy Ryan and Michaela Mayer, I think for me personally, Lauren Price beats them both. And I think we haven't really seen Lauren Price get out of that metaphorical second gear. I think Natasha Jonas didn't really do anything wrong in the fight. I just think Lauren Price was very good in that fight, and she just made her look an older fighter that she is. And for Tasha now, retirement has to happen for me personally. I've been saying it for a few years. It's what I want to see for her. I think she's been an absolute godsend for women's boxing over the past 13, 14 years, both amateur and as a professional, and she's achieved so much when there was a moment where I didn't think maybe she would become a world champion when she got stopped by Vivian Obanov all those years back. So for me, she's definitely achieved what she set out to achieve and her potential. And for Lauren Price, the sky's the limit now in terms of where she does go. So it does bring some excitement stepping into that new generation of fighters that are around. And you've rightly pointed out, and we've said this multiple times on the show, that the depths of the divisions aren't very deep. And as a result of that, it allows fighters to move between the weights quite easily, as we've seen with the likes of Clarissa Shields moving all the way up to heavyweight and, being champion in middleweight and super middleweight and doing all these different things in different weights. So, it bodes well for someone like Lauren Price, who's got the skills, who could potentially transfer that into another division and be a two-weight world champion, or maybe even a two-weight undisputed champion. Who knows? But it was a good performance from her. I was really impressed. I felt she did everything she needed to do to get the win, and she moves forward now. So, other fights on the card that we spoke about. I think we spoke about Caroline Dubois quite a lot, about potential and where she goes, and she's another one of this generation that's taking, the women's boxing scene forward. I felt she again was just another performance from her where it's the opponent was good, but not good enough to really test Caroline Dubois, I felt personally. And I think she's moving forward and continuing on to try and look for big fights. It sounds like she wants the big fights, but it's just like they'll come when they come, and I'll happily rise to the occasion for them. But she got a good win, in my opinion, and I think she does. A promotional team and a management really need to push forward and start aiming for big fights now for her, because I think it's needed. I think if you're going to excel Caroline to another level, when you look around at what other female fighters are doing at the moment and how quickly they're getting their opportunities to unify divisions, I think it would be quite wise to do that with Caroline. I know we've spoke quite a lot about her. You've been quite impressed with her. Any thoughts on the performance from Friday?
I mean, it's just for me, it's what happens when you stay active, right? So Caroline Dubois has looked really good, and it's not unlike what happened to Abdullah Mason. You stay active, you fight someone that people assume isn't good, and then you have a hard fight, and then everyone goes, "Oh man, and she's not this or she's not that." And maybe a little bit of the hype got to her, maybe that, but also like fighting a lot, you're gonna have nights where you don't perform, and you're gonna have nights where the other person is just as sharp as they're ever going to be, and that's honestly why I think in the last 15 years, fighters, besides the paycheck being more expensive and people can't pay the fighters what they want to be paid, I think that's why people aren't as active. Because if you fight 3 times a year and you're fighting 3 world-class opponents, there's a chance you could be in a majority decision win, split decision. And a lot of fans look at that as a blemish on your record, even though you won. So I think that that's just what happens when you're just very active. You have tough fights, and I just thought that it was a tough fight for her.
One person I felt like I needed to really see something out of or move forward in her career was Carice Artingstall against Raven Chapman. And I felt she did that in the fight against Raven Chapman. I knew Raven was going to come in and be a really tough opponent for her. But I think what I was asking for, what I wanted to see is her step up, is move forward and be more aggressive and be more concise with what she was doing in the ring. And sometimes it felt like she was just going through the motions. But now in this particular fight against Raven on Friday, I felt like that was for me her standout performance so far in her 7 fights now. That was the one that made me stand up and go, do you know what? Actually, I'm starting to warm more to the fact that I want to see more of this. That I think, in the featherweight division, she really could become a champion quite quickly, but she's got to put performances on like that. Is it a case with certain fighters, Lukie, that they only tend to rise to the level of their opponent? Because you can't expect a fighter to always be on point in every single fight, but when you get a fighter who's absolutely talented, who's a really skillful fighter, but hasn't got the opponent in front of him to actually show them skills and excel them to that level, is it a case of like in this with Carice Artingstall, she rose to the occasion because the opponent was a much better opponent than what she'd faced before?
I don't know. I think that maybe there's a little bit of that, but I think sometimes development takes time. Some of the opponents Artingstall had fought, I thought were really solid opponents, not quite as good as Raven Chapman, who I think is basically a title holder that might not hold a belt, or it'll take her a little bit longer than you expect because she's running into the top fighters before they have belts. Or when in one case she fought for a belt. But I think it's just each fighter's development is unique to their own, and she was able to have the performance she needed because she's been very underwhelming up until this point, but she was able to put it all together. And now comes the hard part, right? Because there's 2 ways to look at it. Did she turn a corner, or is she an inconsistent fighter? So now going into the next fight, we have to see, is she going to be able to be consistent and build off of this, or are we going to have highs and lows?
Only time will tell, of course. Chloe Watson and Jasmine Zappo. Jasmine Zappo got the victory, and for anybody that ask why I call her Zappo, it's because I'm terrible with the pronunciation of her surname. So Jasmina Zappo got the victory. I think there was a lot of people that didn't feel Jasmina would get the victory here, but now she's become a European champion as a result of beating the previously undefeated Chloe Watson, which I felt like was a decent moment for that particular card. Actually, I felt like I like to see underdogs actually get victories, and I felt like she was an underdog in this fight, Jasmina, and obviously in the previous fight she'd gone in and essentially it felt like she'd been spoon-fed to Maisie Rose Courtney, and she went and beat her, and now she's gone and beat another undefeated fighter in Chloe Watson to become the European champion, and it's great to see these types of things happen where essentially the away fighter, who's kind of destined to lose, actually goes on and picks up these big wins on the road. And I think I've been two back-to-back big wins for her, and the European titles come as a result of it. So it's really going to be interesting to see how they match her up now moving forward, showing that she's actually beating some of these other female fighters that are being touted for big things. And maybe it's just that she's been underrated and not been viewed in the same way. She's come up in a different way than some of these fighters, where she's fought on the smaller hall shows and not been given TV debuts very early on in their careers. So it's nice to kind of see that, and I've always been an advocate for that. So that was really good to see. And then Francesca Hennessy as well, getting the victory on the card. Mick Hennessy's daughter, former promoter of Tyson Fury earlier on in his career, she moves to 6-0 on this particular card as well to get another victory in the bag. Fights that happened as well elsewhere in the UK. I mentioned it in the preview. We talked a little bit about it. Harlem Eubank and Tyrone McKenna. Harlem Eubank getting the stoppage in 10 rounds. I think that was a good win for Harlem Eubank. I think that was a win he needed to move forward in his career. I think Tyrone's always been a really good operator. When he's lost to pretty good fighters. And I think Harlem needed that name on his resume that could say, actually, I'm at this level now. There was a sort of minor rankings title up for grabs here, the IBF Intercontinental Welterweight title, but it's certainly put Harlem Eubank now in a position where I think he should start calling for bigger names in the division and start really sort of testing his mettle against these bigger names. And what did you think of Harlem Eubank's performance? Obviously, he's got the name, Lukie, and he's always going to be overshadowed by the other Eubank name, but he's starting to forge his own path a little bit more, and I think it feels like he's going a little bit under the radar. And I know you don't necessarily pay attention to Harlem in the past, but after getting a win like this, is this the sort of victory that would make you pay attention to him moving forward?
I mean, to me, I put him in like a fringe contender status, so he exists. But like, I'm not gonna stop what I'm doing to watch his fights. I want to see the results. I think that conversely, the Jasmine win, now she becomes someone. So like when you win 2 upset wins, now I'm going to go out of my way to make sure I find those results. Whereas Harlem Eubank, I'm going to be aware that he fights, but I mean, there's going to be fights I miss. Just perfectly honest. McKenna's a solid veteran, but I think that most top tier prospects beat McKenna at this point. So, I mean, all it tells me is that he's following a trajectory of good fighters, that they do a similar result. So I'd like to see him just kind of continue to ramp up the competition so I could make like a proper assessment.
Michael Conlan returned with a victory on this particular card, and when I put the video out of the podcast from last week on the Facebook account, one of the subscribers on Facebook and someone who I know, Adam Conlan, had some comments about Michael Conlan. He felt like maybe I was being a little bit unfair on where Michael Conlan's at in his career at the moment, and that's fine. Adam, I'll address it on this one. I still don't think he's got that level in him where people expected him to be at. I think Michael Conlan is a guy who European world title contender maybe, but I just don't think he's ever going to get to that echelon of being a world champion. I really don't believe that. I personally think we've seen the best of him. I just can't see at this stage how he's going to improve and become a world champion. He's still young in terms of boxing. He's 33, but I just can't see how he's going to improve to become a world champion. And he got a points decision over 8 rounds against a fighter that not really many people have heard of. In the super featherweight division, is really talented. There's a lot of good guys out there. Could a fight be lined up with a Jazza Dickens after his win over Zelfa Barrett? Yeah, absolutely. That could be a good fight, domestically in Europe. But in terms of world title aspirations, Adam, I'm going to address it and say, no, I don't think he's going to become a world champion. I'm just solidified in that opinion that I just don't think he's got what it takes at this moment in time in this generation to become a world champion. Maybe at a different time, maybe if there wasn't so many talented fighters around, maybe he could have been a world champion, but I just don't think he's going to be. I'm going to hand that over to you, Lukie, just to sort of jump on the back of that and some thoughts on Michael Conlan. Again, he got the win, but are the same as me? Are you solidified in that opinion? Have you got any thoughts about where Conlan goes now?
Look, he's at a stage where he had a really important moment in amateur boxing for Irish boxing, and he came up alongside Katie Taylor, and he really means a lot to a lot of Irish fans. But I don't think he can go to the world level anymore. But if he wants to just do European fights, and I get it, because look, imagine if like someone said to me, "Hey, you can't podcast and you can't talk boxing." 2 to 3 years later, I go to a gym, I help a kid jab, and then all of a sudden I want to do it again. I'm not going to begrudge someone that's young enough that still has hunger to want to compete because they did it their whole life. I just want him to do it in safe capacities where he's not endangering himself. So for me, I'm fine with him continuing his career. I just hope it stays as more of a European attraction. And what I really don't want to see is him become a stepping stone to up and comers kind of using his name and his legacy.
That's a fair point. Whether people agree with that point is another question. But you know what? It's open to have that conversation. If you drop comments on the Facebook video, if you're doing it via YouTube, if you're doing it just via the socials in general, more than welcome to sort of address those points. And that's really it, sort of from the UK and European perspective. Any notable moments over the weekend that you want to discuss from a US perspective, Luca?
Sure. There's only one card I can think of, and it was a Pro Box TV card. By the way, if you're in the UK, these Pro Box TV cards are bad ass. They are great cards, start to finish. I'm really enjoying them. The big fight, the main event, I think matters on a global scale. Joet Gonzalez defeats the number 2 ranked WBO featherweight title challenge or title ranked fighter, whatever the rankings, the WBO rankings number 2. Arnold Kaige or Kaige. I can't say his last name. So Arnold, Joey Gonzalez back in the mix again. And Joey Gonzalez, one of these guys that, he probably has 1 or 2 losses he shouldn't have. And if you look at his record, the only guys he loses to are like the best in the generation, or it's a debated, split majority decision. Like he lost to the best version of Emmanuel Navarrete, Shakur Stevenson fighting for his first world title. Gave Venado Lopez a tough fight. The Isaac Dogboe fight, I thought that he probably won it, but didn't get the decision. So I think that that's interesting because like featherweight's kind of reshaping, and he's a guy that I think people have forgot about or maybe written off, but it seems like there's still a lot or some left in there. I mean, shoot, imagine Joet Gonzalez versus Michael Conlan. That's a good little European fight right there. So that was an interesting result. Louis Lopez and Jesus Sriracha. Sriracha is a guy on Pro Box TV that's really established himself as kind of a beat you up, tough veteran guy who doesn't say no to fights. He's had trouble with weight at times. I think he missed weight even for this fight. I'm not exactly sure. But they fought to a draw and they both kind of looked like they got beat up. So that was a fun one. And I'm trying off the top of my head to remember who the co-feature was for this card because it was Nicholas Walters. So Luis Torres stops Nicholas Walters, and that's kind of topical too, because Nicholas Walters got that knockout probably before a lot of people that are listening to this watch boxing. He knocked out Nonito Donaire when Donaire was trying to ascend through the weight classes and go as high as he could, kind of maybe not directly saying it, but mirroring the plight of Manny Pacquiao, who is also a big Filipino star. So Walters, weird exchange. I'm not sure if you saw it. Left hook, turns his back in the ring, and then the referee kind of counts him, but kind of gives him like a champion's credit of like, hey, do you want to continue? And no fighter is ever going to be like, nah, man, I don't want to do it. So he gets to the corner waves it off. Another interesting subplot, Bob Santos working as a cut man in the main event and Coach Torres in the co-feature. I thought that was kind of cool to see kind of really high level coaches doing kind of a lot of different things in that. So that's about what I think you need to know if you're just kind of tuning into the podcast to stay topical.
So, topical is a really good word to use right now because I think the biggest piece of news in boxing in the last week was the entrance into boxing of Dana White, obviously part of TKO and the UFC merger that happened not so long ago, is now working with Turki Al-Sheikh to bring himself into boxing. And there's a lot of talk going on at the moment about what he's planning to do. He's going to be like a boxing league. There's only going to be so many divisions. A lot of the bridger divisions are going to be scrapped in this boxing league, and then there's only going to be one belt in it. Dana White says he wants to come and clean boxing up from the ground upwards. That was what he said in a press conference. I posted it out on social media, that little clip of him saying that. It's huge, huge news for the boxing world. Interpret this how you will, really, ladies and gentlemen. A lot of people feel like Turki Al-Sheikh has been sort of using the other promoters to eventually get to Dana White. People have got their own opinions about Dana White and how he could bring the UFC model to boxing and how that's a good thing. But then there's other people complaining that he doesn't even pay his fighters in the UFC properly. So how is that going to reflect into the boxing world? It's huge news, Lukie. I'm just wondering what your perception and take is on this, because there's so many different avenues of conversation with this, so many different strands. But if you could try and sum it up, how would you sum this move up?
Don't get in trouble. Like whenever I get on a podcast, that's like my first sum up is don't get in trouble. I don't know. Like everything I knew about boxing now no longer exists. Everything, every preconceived notion, every smartest guy in the room take, it's all the scripts being torn up and lit on fire. So I don't follow UFC. I've watched fights in the past, right? Good fights. But I'm not someone that was like, man, I can't wait to see UFC, whatever. And I didn't ever really follow the sub storylines of like the business of the UFC. So I'm unfamiliar with Dana White as a character in boxing or as a businessman, really. And I'm taking a wait and see approach, right? Because it's like nothing that's happening has ever happened in my boxing lifetime. And I'm just going to wait and see how it plays out. And that's really just, and it sounds like the most lame, no opinion, anything, but it's like if you would have told me Fury and Usyk were fighting twice last year, Beterbiev and Bivol would have fought 2 times in the period of like 5 months, and that we're getting a card with Ryan Garcia, Devin Haney, and Teofimo Lopez all fighting on the card, all in matchups that are somewhat compelling or interesting. And it's in Times Square, I would have been like, nah, I don't think that's happening. And now it's happening. So the fact that that's happening now makes me just go, okay, everything I thought wasn't possible is now possible. So I just want to wait and see what's going to happen because I don't even know. Like I don't even know how to look at things.
I think the term we could probably use for that is expect the unexpected, because that is exactly what boxing is doing right now. Expect the unexpected. Kind of bleeds nicely into what you just said about summarizing Fury Usyk, Beterbiev Bivol, a card going on in Times Square. I mean, none of this stuff felt feasible 2 years ago, did it? Let's be honest. And now all of a sudden things are happening that some of it can be perceived as very positive for the sport. Some of it can be perceived with skepticism around how it's all going to work. The news about Dana White coming into boxing, again, I don't follow UFC. So for those that love boxing and UFC, you could probably be a bit more educated than us on that. My understanding of Dana White and what he's done is he's brought the UFC with some support from absolutely nothing to a multi-million-dollar company, which, you know, a lot of people thoroughly enjoy. I understand there's not as many weight classes in the UFC. I understand there's usually only a main belt and sometimes an interim belt. Again, this is just my understanding of what I know. So, you know, don't shoot the messenger. This is just all I know. If that format was brought to boxing and there were only a number of divisions with only one belt in it, would I be for that? Yes, I would. I would happily like to see the big names have to fight each other to become the champion, as opposed to four different organizations taking percentages of these fighters' purses to be held as champions, and then all these multiple versions of their belts. I want to see that gone. So, for me personally, I'm going to wait and see what happens. The principle of what's being said sounds amazing. Like, the heavyweight division has one belt. Everybody has to fight everybody. That's the only way it's going to be. We're talking of a time, you know, in the golden era of boxing. That's what we want to see. As fans, we would love to go back to that. You know, we cover a lot of history on this network, and I always envisage what it would have been like to have lived during periods of time when this was just one belt and the best had to fight the best no matter what happened. I would love to see that now, because I do think it would certainly weed out the pretenders amongst the actual real superstars of this particular sport. And we would get the most compelling matchups. We're already getting that with the way boxing has gone most recently. But this format, this adaptation in boxing is potentially going to bring that completely. I don't know what the knock-on effect will be of it. I don't know how it's going to look. I don't know who it's going to upset, who's going to be cut out of the picture, what fighters are going to be involved. None of it's known at the moment, really. So until that happens, I can't genuinely get overly excited about this. In theory, the principle of it sounds great, and I would welcome it. I know that a lot of people have got skepticism around it. There's a lot of people with positivity and negativity. It is just going to be, let's wait and see. And that's all we can do at the moment, because we really don't know how it's all going to look. But again, I'll reiterate, the theory of it in principle for me sounds amazing. And it would be an ideal way to make the best fight the best without anybody bypassing anybody. And we can take all this stuff away about such a fighter not wanting to fight another fighter. If they haven't got a choice to fight that fighter, we're going to really know who the best of the division is. So I'll leave it at that, because obviously we've got other things to cover in the show. If you do want to put your opinion out there on what we've said, please do that on YouTube if you're watching, or on Facebook if you're watching. If you've been listening via the audio route, please just drop a comment on Spotify or any of the available podcasting apps that you can comment on that you've listened on. Please do drop a comment on there. Same goes for patrons as well. If you want to drop a comment in there, please do. And we will move on now to another topic of conversation, which is, of course, this coming weekend. So this coming weekend in England, the big fights that are happening is Nick Ball's return to the Echo Arena in Liverpool to face TJ Doheny. And we've got Andrew Kane versus Charlie Edwards. Another interesting fight is Brad Strand versus Ion Baluta on that particular card as well. That's probably the big fight for me that I'm looking forward to over the weekend. But in America, we've got the return of Amal Williams, as well as the return of Edgar Berlanga to the ring as well. So, Lukie, I'm just going to start with the Nick Ball card and the Nick Ball fight against TJ Doheny. I mean, we sat and did a little bit of a preview for your podcast last week about this, so it'll feel a little bit for us like going over old ground. But for those that are listening to us on BTR, Nick Ball versus TJ Doheny, how do you see this going? is it a strategic move to look at what Nick Ball can do against a former Inoue opponent with a view to potentially having an Inoue fight for Nick Ball down the line? Because that has been spoken about multiple times, and Nick Ball and his team are very much welcoming the possibility of that fight.
I mean, it has to, there's no coincidences in boxing, and there's no secrets. There's only head starts. I was once told by Terry Lane that or Bruce Trampler had told him that. That's a good quote. And I say that to say, I don't think that Nick Ball is just fighting TJ Doheny because it's the opponent that randomly was given. I think there's a reason to the season, and that reason being it's a comparable opponent, and I fully expect Ball to have a better performance than Inoue had. And if you look at it, Ball's a shorter fighter for the featherweight division. So if Inoue were to move up and there were concerns about his frame or how things go, though Ball is a power puncher and a strong guy, there are some limitations that make it more of an equitable and strategic move up in the weight class as opposed to taking on, say, like a Rafael Espinoza, who's a 6 foot tall featherweight. So I think that of all the champions, you're probably Nick Ball is really just sitting there going, okay, I've got a real shot. So if he can have a performance this weekend where he looks a lot better, then I think that he has a really, really good chance at getting the public. And I think that's the point of this fight. The public saying, man, Nick Ball looked better than Neo Inoue. And I don't know if you've noticed this, Inoue kind of set a standard for himself that was so high, fighting champion after champion. There's a lot of people that are frustrated with Inoue's recent run. You look at it and people are going, wait, you're fighting this guy, you're fighting that guy. So I think that there's a lot of leverage that Ball could possibly use fans who want to see Inoue back in a consequential bout. They could possibly force this fight or put a lot of pressure.
Well, I feel like this fight is strategically put into place to see how Nick Ball does against a former Inoue opponent. That's what people are saying. That's what the interpretation is of this fight. If he can do better than what Inoue did, there's the comparison that Nick Ball might be the guy to really put it on Inoue and be the guy that maybe can systematically break him down. Sounds like a huge statement, I know, but I know there's been a lot of detractors of Inoue recently that have thought that maybe, just maybe, that Inoue is on the decline, ever so slightly. I don't really say I want to agree to that just at this moment in time, because I haven't seen anything majorly significant that makes me think that, Inoue is on the decline as a fighter. I think when a fighter has one bad moment in a fight or one bad or average performance, automatically a lot of people, myself included at times, have kind of been quick to go, you know what, maybe they're on the decline. And then in the very next fight, they come back and put on an emphatic performance that makes you kind of change that opinion. And that's how fickle boxing can be at times, of course. But I think what Nick Ball needs to do is he does need to be emphatic in this fight, and he needs to go in there and he needs to stop TJ Doheny, and he needs to do it in quicker fashion if he's really looking for that potential fight with Inoue. That's my opinion. I think Nick Ball, I've always enjoyed his performances. I've watched him from day dot when he first turned professional, on the small hall shows. I've watched his progression. And one of the things that always really surprised me when I looked at Nick was like his stature. And I thought, I just can't imagine Nick being the type of fighter that's going to go on and really, excel. But as his career went through, and I started to notice that actually he's starting to really systematically break these guys down, and size disadvantage doesn't seem to play any factor in his fights. He actually seems to use it to his advantage in his fights. So it'd be really interesting to see how he gets on with Doheny in this fight, and what the conversations are afterwards, and whether there's a potential for him to be involved in a big fight with Inoue, or whether they're looking at running another fight as a result of it. So I'm expecting him to win. I don't think it's going to be easy, but I think if he can break him down and get the stoppage, it'll be great. If he doesn't, and it goes to points and he gets the win that way, I think there will be detractors. I wouldn't be remiss around it. I don't think it's a bad thing for Nick Ball to get 12 rounds under the belt, going into potential big fight and getting even more experience as he moves along as a world champion. So I'm not remiss, with something like that happening, to be honest with you, Lukie. I think it's not a bad thing for him to potentially get more rounds under the belt, but we'll just have to see how it plays out. Another fight on the card then. Charlie Edwards, a former world champion who obviously has been known on these shores for quite some time. His brother Sonny was also a world champion. He's going in there against Andrew Kane. There's a British title on the line, Commonwealth title on the line, and an international silver WBC title on the line as well. I feel this is a moment that Charlie Edwards at 32, if he's going to really push forward with an aspiration to fight for a world title again, he's got to win. Simple as that. He's got to win this fight. Obviously, he was a former world champion. He won the EBU European Bantamweight Championship in his last fight. So, for me, winning this fight would be a good way for him to move forward for a possible Bantamweight title shot in the future. But he's facing Andrew Kane, who, ironically, Andrew Kane, actually, his only loss on his resume is to a fighter that's also on the same card as well. The Ion Baluta fight a couple of fights back was one that he lost via split decision, but he's since come back and had 3 stoppage victories, and he's currently the British champion and Commonwealth champion going into this particular fight. It does feel like a crossroads fight. I don't think I've seen the best of Charlie since he was a world champion. I feel like for different reasons, it just doesn't seem to have got going again in his career. I think he needs this victory if he has got them world title aspirations, as I said. But I'm not going to count Andrew Kane out of this fight because he is the British and Commonwealth champion, and actually he could be the one that moves forward and actually starts to excel in his career at this point. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this particular fight, Lukie.
Look, I'm not gonna pretend like I'm some expert on British boxing, but I'm tuning in with very low expectations. I believe both guys are part of the Nick Ball team, or have at least I think Andrew Kane is with Nick Ball's coaches, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm looking at it as just like I'm tuning in to guys that I don't have a deep attachment to, but there's not much going on, and I'm gonna try to watch some fights that could propel someone to that world class level. So I'm going to watch these fights because I think there is consequence to the bouts, that this is getting high enough up where the winner and the loser are going to be in bouts that I have to care about.
Also on this, I mentioned earlier, Brad Strand and Ion Baluta, European WBO Super Bantamweight Championship up for grabs in this particular one. A lot of prospects and journeyman fights going on this particular card, but I think for me, the only ones I'm really interested in tuning into is, of course, the Brad Strand fight, Andrew Kane, Charlie Edwards, and Nick Ball versus Tijo Doheny on this particular card. But I'm going to move over to America now and talk about the fights that are happening on DAZN in Orlando. This was something we spoke about on your pod. Aston Williams against Patrice Volney. The return of Ammo Williams since his loss to Hamza Sheeraz has left people questioning whether he's good enough, whether he can move forward in his career, whether he can rebuild and potentially fight for a world title. He's fighting Patrice Volney, who for the wider masses won't really be known, but obviously over there in America and Canada is notable. He's more known. He's had some really good wins in his last 3 particular fights that have really led him into this one. Talk a little bit about Ammo Williams. Talk a little bit about Patrice Volney, Lukie. Then about this fight. Is it quite a risky fight potentially for Williams at this stage? Is there a risk that he could actually lose this one?
I think it's a 50-50 fight, right? Because I think that the thing with Ammo Williams is there's obviously a lot of talent there. And I know maybe some, once again, the people that only watch world class boxing might go, what do you mean? But I mean, he made it to the top of the amateurs. He's done very well as a pro. Someone might go, oh, he lost to Shiraz. Well, Shiraz looks like a top 10 guy. So that's not a huge indictment on it. But I think the thing with Ammo is I see talent, I see athleticism, I see power. Now we got to see coachability. Now we got to see, can you adjust? Can you improve? Because it seems like the one thing that makes me question how far he can go as a fighter is he gets hit a lot. He gets hit a lot and it's not improving really. He's capable of starting quickly. He's capable of being fast and hitting people with hard shots. That's something he's done, but he does get hit a lot. So he needs to improve on this. I said on my little podcast with you on the Substack newsletter, this fight to me on paper has the makings of being a fight of the year. Patrice Volney is a slow starter. Williams is a fast starter. Williams could get going quickly in this fight. Volney put a lot of pressure on Stephen Bang Bang Butler in the second half of that fight. I didn't think that he'd be able to win the fight. He did. So I think that the longer this fight goes, the harder it gets for Ammo Williams. I think it's a real 50, 60, 40 type fight for Williams. But if Williams knocks it out the park and gets a quick knockout, he's a real guy in this division. So, and I believe it's a super middleweight bout, right?
I think he's down as middleweight. He's still showing as middleweight at the moment. I don't know if there's been any
Okay.
changes to that.
Okay, so I'm unsure about the weight class because the weight class I've heard different things. So, yeah, I mean that's basically my assessment is like this is a really tough opponent for Ammo who basically gets you zero credit. You know, it's kind of everything you don't want to fight as a young fighter. Here's a main event fight. You're main eventing in a kind of a random area, a good area, Orlando, good venue, but it's kind of random. And you're taking on a guy who can really fight who's 35.
I'm interested to see how he gets on in this fight. I think it will be a telling factor as to whether he will move forward and go for a world title shot. But I think he's got to put on a performance that leaves no doubt, really, that he is back and he is ready for that. But if he's got a difficult opponent in the opposite corner, that's going to cause him problems and make it a 50-50 fight. It's probably going to be an interesting one for people watching as well this coming weekend. Also on this card, Edgar Berlanga returns against undefeated Jonathan Gonzalez Ortiz. Interested to see what is happening in the career of Edgar Berlanga. He's put a few names out there, the likes of Jaime Munguia, Caleb Plant as fighters that he would like to fight, but he's got to get past Jonathan Gonzalez Ortiz, an undefeated fighter. Edgar Berlanga is getting a lot of detractors at the moment. Every time I go on social media, I just see, yeah, that's it, that Canelo fight has just exposed him. He isn't a good fighter. He's not what people think he was. Is that a bit of unfair criticism to Berlanga because he's took that fight with Canelo and lost that fight with Canelo last year? Because before that, Lukie, he was touted as a really, really hot prospect, a really hot fighter, and then all of a sudden he faces Canelo, he loses, and now he's to the wider audience, to the boxing fan, he's just well, he isn't as good as what I thought he was, so he isn't going to do anything, and that seems to be the general consensus of opinion that I've been seeing across social media with him.
I'm really big on Berlanga. I like his coach. I think he's got a lot of talent. I think a lot of the criticism is a victim to his own greatness. He started his career off with 16 straight first round knockouts. And I think that built an anticipation. It was kind of like there was a WCW pro wrestler back when I used to watch pro wrestling named Bill Goldberg, and they used to have a clock. How fast will it be for Goldberg to pin a guy? And it was almost, they started doing that with Berlanga. How fast will it be until he knocks this guy out? And really, that next level, those main event fights, was when he had to do his development most fighters on undercards do because he was knocking guys out at the level below the main event level. So he had to take those hard lessons in main event fights. He had to get that ring time at that high level. So I think Berlang is a top 10 guy in the division. I think that he's a young kid who has a lot of talent, who a lot of older people don't really understand this generation, the Instagram generation and all that. And for whatever reason, a young, confident guy who's knocking people out, saying stuff on the internet bugs people. But I see him as he's going to shock people. I see him as people are looking at him as an overvalued, overrated fighter, and he's going to come up and beat a couple of guys that people think are more distinguished than him in a couple of years. And I wouldn't be shocked if this fight is 1 or 2 rounds. I wouldn't be shocked if he knocks this guy out very quickly because I think that Berlanga is extremely motivated, and I think he feels disrespected because he did well against Canelo. He didn't really win rounds per se, but he stayed in there and he hasn't been through a lot of hard wars. So I'm very high on Berlanga.
I like Berlanga. I just feel it's unfair criticism. That's why I asked the question, because I feel like, again, when a fighter loses, because he's been highly touted, he loses to a generational pound for pound, arguably best Mexican fighter of all time, and all of a sudden he's nothing. I mean, that's what annoys me with the average boxing fan. He's so fickle. Like, you can't just say that Berlanga isn't going to go on and do something in his career because he's had one fight against one of the very best of this generation and maybe multiple generations. You've got to look at what he does next. For me, it's all about what a fighter does when he loses. It's like saying when Canelo lost to Mayweather, it's like writing Canelo off saying, well, he wasn't as good as what we thought he was anyway. But look, after he lost to Floyd Mayweather, look what he went on to do. Look at the run he went on until his next loss against Dimitri Bivol. So you can't really judge him based upon that one loss in his career. And that's because of the whole Floyd Mayweather era as well. Like, I've never lost a fight. And that sort of interpretation of, as a fighter, you're not allowed to lose a fight. Well, you don't want to lose a fight. You don't go in there with a losing mentality. You go in there to win. But if you lose a fight, you look back at that fight and you go, what can I learn? What can I make myself better with? And Canelo did that when he came back after losing to Mayweather. So for me, it's only the same with someone like a Berlanga who's going in there now and needs to put on a performance and make a statement to say, do you know what? That was my loss. I've improved. I'm better. And I'm moving forward in his career. His opponent, obviously, is not someone I think he's just going to walk over, but I certainly think it's going to be an interesting fight. I think it potentially could be a little bit of a firefight, and that's where maybe Berlanga will succeed in this fight. So it's definitely one that I'm interested in watching on this particular card. I'm looking forward to the return of Jermaine Ortiz, but I know there's one particular fight on this card that we spoke about on your Substack that's really exciting you, and that's the Jose Roman Vasquez and a Jaleel Hackett fight, Lukie. So for our listeners, just give a bit of a synopsis of their return bout that we're going to be seeing and how this has led up to this moment.
Sorry, I just got a text. Jaleel Hackett and Jose Roman fight. Is that what you said?
I did.
Okay, good. Just I didn't. That's where I was going to go, but I got a text, and I sometimes get that thing. I don't know if the listeners get this, where you get a text and you forget everything someone just told you, and yeah, I could have just winged it, or I can clarify and just look like a dummy, and I chose the latter. So Jaleel Hackett was signed with Mayweather Promotions, I believe, in 2021, and he was really touted as this guy that could possibly follow in the footsteps of Gervonta Tank Davis. People were very high on him and the potential that he had in the sport. And then, quite frankly, he just hasn't been that active, and he hasn't been in front of a lot of eyes to get his name out there. He signs with Eddie Hearn last year. He fights Pete Dobson on a Boots Ennis undercard, who was a guy who had just fought Conor Benn. He beats him. Pretty impressive. I think he had the impression that he was going to be a fast-track prospect. He fights Jose Roman, a guy who'd only lost once, and he lost to my guy Cesar Francis. Really good boxer, very underrated fighter. So he loses to him. From losing to him, then he ends up kind of getting written off, Roman. So Roman is a Puerto Rican fighter who fights Hackett in Puerto Rico on the Hitchens Paro card. Hitchens obviously beats Paro in the main event, but this fight was awful. This was a terrible fight where I think Jaleel was looking to knock him out and throwing one punch at a time, pushing him back. And I thought Hackett won. It was kind of a weird, maybe I'm a homer, but I thought Hackett won and I thought Mark Castro won their fights. But there was a level of anticipation for both fighters that they were a class above the opponents. And because they didn't separate, I feel as though the judges started kind of scoring 50-50 rounds for the opponent because there was I think we're not supposed to have bias, but you enter every conversation with bias, right? And I feel as though in especially Hackett's case, but somewhat Mark Castro's fight too, this fighter, a lot of people didn't expect to do well, and he was competitive in each round, and he ended up winning a split decision. So for me, it's a career crossroads for both guys because if Roman wins, he's going to be a guy. You just beat a prospect 2 times in a row. You've changed your destiny. And for Jaleel Hackett, if he loses this fight, he turns into like, what do you do? Is he a fringe contender with 2 losses at 9-2? So it's a very, very impactful and important fight at a stage we don't usually see prospects in early in their development. Probably told too much about that fight, but that's my thoughts.
No, I'm glad that you've done because obviously it wasn't really a fight I tuned into. When we did your podcast last week and I went and looked into that fight a bit further, I was like, actually, this is a fight. How has this escaped me? But this is the thing, like the beauty of us doing the pod together is, you've got more of an insight into what's going on in the US and Canadian circuit. And for me, it's obviously predominantly the UK stuff. So to be able to go away and then look at that fight and then think, oh, actually, that really, really looks like something I really want to watch and really get my teeth into. So, for the listeners, you guys do need to go and tune into this fight. Tune into the first fight, then tune into this one because I don't think you're going to be disappointed. I think it's going to be one of those fights on the card that maybe, if you're only tuning in to watch the Berlanga or the Austin Williams fight, actually don't sleep on a fight like this because, you might be pleasantly surprised by what you might see here. Just another note from this card, then, Lukie, the debut of Omari Jones as well. I mean, looked phenomenal as an amateur. How is he going to translate this over? Is he everything that he's being hyped up to be? Do you think he can translate that into the professional side of the sport?
Sure, why not? I've known him for a few years now. I believe I first talked to him in 2021 or 2022. We've been talking for a few years now, and I quite like him. Big fan of him. He reminds me a lot of Errol Spence when Errol was young. And I'm not saying in terms of how he fights, but in terms of like the way he is as a person. Errol was like this very country but confident guy, and Omari has this way where like he's very professional, but he's very polished. He's kind of like a Sugar Ray Leonard, so he's not going to ever give you I'm emotional, let me just say some stuff. But most high level amateurs, if you move them correctly, right? If you, I shouldn't say move, if you develop a fighter correctly and you don't overvalue what you have, because every fighter can be beat. Every fighter has a matchup that's not a satisfactory matchup. But let me take this to a deeper conversation that I find more interesting, and your listeners probably won't because I'm going to get off the track of the subject. So I believe, and I'm not a matchmaker, but this is the way I see things, is the highest level of the sport, the fights make themselves. And at this point, that's never been more true, right? You get to a high level, you're an interesting fighter, there's going to be big fights for you. And if you get to the point where you're in the rankings, you really should pursue matchups that either benefit you financially or move you up into the contender rankings. But when you're a young fighter like Omari Jones, right? I believe he's turning pro in a 6 round fight. Okay, that's interesting, right? You're basically saying my Olympic pedigree means that I'm going to skip 4 round fights. And for anybody a little inside boxing, 4 round fights can be some of the toughest fights because, all it takes is one knockdown and now all of a sudden a fight could go either way. So you get that 6 round duration. Now they always, when I was coming up in gyms, they'd always say class showed over time. So if you go a little bit longer with a deep amateur, they're probably going to figure things out and be able to win the fights. But he's starting at that level. But what I would say, and I'm sure they're going to do this because it's a big company and they're smart. You got to give him the southpaw look. You got to give him the puncher look, and you got to give him all these different styles and see how he handles it because that crossover from professional to amateur, it's not always seamless. And you have to give people interesting tests to get them to the point where you can just put them in any fight. And that's the art form. So I think he has a ton of potential. And I think it's just all about the roadmap that's laid out in front of him.
I totally agree. I don't think I can add anything of value to those comments. Like, I've got nothing to push back on you with, really, because I think that's kind of how I perceive a fighter like this to be moved forward in the career, to progress forward in the career. I think that's the logical way, in my opinion. So it's just one of those fights where I say, look, you can watch him, tune into him, but for the general audience, it's more than likely that you guys will probably go, oh, I'll watch his first couple of fights, or maybe I'll wait till he's 4, 5, 6 and 0, and then I'll kind of tune into what he's going to bring to the ring. And that's fine. That's fair enough. It's just one of those notable things that are happening this weekend that I felt like it was something that we needed to address with this particular card as well. And I can't be remiss without talking about the fact that we've got a really interesting fight happening at MSG Theatre, which is the Callum Walsh and Dean Sutherland fight happening on that card, which is on USA UFC Fight Pass. Callum Walsh is a fighter who I don't think a lot of UK based boxing fans, and I'm not speaking for obviously Irish boxing fans here, I'm talking about England, Wales, Scotland. I don't think a lot of fans from these countries are really following what Callum's doing in his career. You know, when you look at what he's doing, he's over in America. His career is based out of America. His last fight, of course, was in Dublin in September last year, but barring that, he's campaigned in America, so not a lot of people may be tuning in to watch where he's going. He's 12-0 with 10 KOs going into a fight against a fighter that I actually know pretty well in Dean Sutherland, who's got 19 wins and one loss on his resume. A guy who's gone through the small hall circuit, who he's going over there with an opportunity to upset the odds, because I do think it's probably against him, even though he's got more professional experience. He's on a pretty decent run. The only loss of his career was to Lewis Green in 2022, but since then he's stepped up and he's got some good wins under his belt. And I think this is going to be an interesting fight. It's going to test Callum, but I do feel like the narrative around this fight is how quick can Callum beat him. I know we were talking about that with Edgar Berlanga a little bit ago in the episode, but I feel like that's kind of the narrative around what's happening in this particular fight. I think for the purposes of those that are listening from a UK perspective, how is he being perceived in the US? How are people looking at him moving forward in this division? You know, a division that needs a superstar in it again.
So there's two school of thoughts, I think. I think there's people that are like really, really excited. He's an interesting character. He's got star potential, and obviously he's probably the first pro boxer that Dana White has really kind of gotten behind, though he hasn't actively promoted him. You've seen some of the Dana White effect that could propel other fighters in the future. So I think that he's built a real fan base that other fighters under 360 promotions haven't been able to capture, to be quite honest. That being said, he's got a lot of hype, and I think there are other people that push back and question just how much does the talent match the hype, because he has had some hard fights early in his development. Now, I think this fight, I like what you say that you think it's going to be a kind of when does Callum land a big shot. I think this is going to be a tough fight, and maybe I'm not aware of the opponent and I'm giving him too much credit, but I think he's an accurate volume puncher, and that Callum is going to win the fight. I see like a 7-3, 6-4, 8-2 type fight. Maybe those are the scores. But his opponent, who I'm blanking on the name, when I watched footage on him, he throws flashy and sometimes inconsequential combinations that are eye-catching. And if Callum doesn't let his hands go, these are going to be very weird rounds to score, because it's going to come down to the competency of it's not even the competency, it's going to come down to where you're seated in an arena and how do punches look like they're landing. And I think this is a fight that's going to come down to clean and effective punching and how that's judged, because I think that the guy fighting Walsh is very good at kind of shoe shining and throwing flurries that could actually swing rounds. So I think this is going to be a bit more of a competitive fight than people think. I think Walsh should win, and I think these are the type of fights that prep you for that next level.
Well, Dean Sutherland is the opponent. I know you're blanking on his name, and I kind of expect that, because obviously it's not someone you followed actively in the US, but having watched him, you're quite accurate in your assessment of what he does in the ring. I think it's going to be an interesting fight. It's one that I want to tune into. It has other fights on the card. There's one that might be of interest to a lot of Irish fans out there. Emmett Brennan versus Kevin Cronin. I think that will be one that I'm looking forward to in the super middleweight division. And you've got Fergal McCrory versus Keenan Carbajal also on there. Notable fights from my perspective anyway. Any other fights from this weekend coming up that you think are of note that maybe our US and Canadian listeners should be tuning into that we haven't already covered?
Let me look through. So Thomas Carty, if he's still fighting on this card, is kind of a character. I'm not sure just how far he can go, but he's a heavyweight, he's Irish, and he's a good soundbite. So like he's a kind of a notable name. Let me look at this little matchroom card. I believe Jermaine Ortiz is coming back this weekend. He fought Teofimo Lopez. He's rebuilding himself. He's in a fight against Yomar Alamo. That's an interesting bout just from the perception of Jermaine Ortiz should fight a champion at some point. Like he had a very close fight with Teofimo Lopez, and he's getting himself back to a point like with a few wins. So I think just being aware that he's fighting, but really, honestly, for the rest of this month, we've got some really good hardcore fights, but we're kind of void of that one fight that I feel like stops the whole boxing world. And honestly, do we even have that in May? Let me look ahead in the schedule. Let me just further delay this podcast even more, guys. But like, I'm not even sure we have that fight until May. I'm looking at the April schedule. We've got stuff coming up, but I mean, it kind of feels like we're in the dog days of boxing where we're waiting for like a big fight. We got Tim Zoo coming up, but the matchup's not that sexy. I guess Boots Stanionis might be that,
Conor
but
Ben, Chris Eubank in the end of
that's the
April is
next
probably
big
the big
one.
one.
Yeah, that's the next big one. So Connor Ben, Chris Eubanks the next big one. But I mean, it just feels like we're getting some really good hardcore fight enthusiast fights, but we're not quite getting those fights where like people that don't watch boxing are like, hey, what's going to happen with this? So I think if you're a hardcore fight fan, these are the greatest cards to tune into because it's like only the insiders. But as someone that covers boxing and loves boxing, you kind of like every 3 to 4 weeks to have a boxing match that stops the world. And it kind of feels like from the tank fight, we're going to go over a month and a half with that.
Well, I suppose it's probably a good way for me to come to the end of the show and plug some of the other stuff that I'm doing as well as your stuff, Lukie. Like, we know we're going to have a bit of a lull in terms of major fights over the next few weeks, with the odd one here or there. So I've just released the Chris Eubank career profile on both BTR and the Career Profiles podcast. So please, if you've not listened to Chris Eubank's part one, please go and listen to it. I really enjoyed doing that episode. It is really leading nicely into the second part, which is going to be released in about a week's time. So if you've not heard the Chris Eubank career profile part one, it is available to listen to right now. Also, of course, I'll always plug all of the other stuff that maybe you haven't heard before, which is 4 seasons of the Legendary Nights podcast and 3 seasons of the Darker Side of Boxing. There's a lot of people that have been listening to me for quite some time who have probably already listened to it. Some may go back and listen to it once again if they've not listened to it for a couple of years. So I really appreciate the fact that people do that, and the fact that they're finding me as well and finding the stuff that I've done historically. So thank you for those that are finding it and commenting on it even a couple of years later. It's great to see. And for those that are supporting me through Patreon, again, I've just got to say thank you for bearing with and giving me the opportunity to be able to keep producing some stuff on there as well. I keep saying I'm going to get you on, Lukie, to do some Patreon stuff, which I am going to schedule something in over the course of the next few weeks and do something that we haven't done for a while on there as well. But just a minute for you, Lukie, to talk about your Substack. I know we do a couple of things now and again with one another to support your stuff that you do. So the floor is yours. Anything that people want to tune into you with, any extras that they can go and find you on and they really want to sort of see more of what you do?
I mean, I'm just trying to have an ecosystem. So I have a podcast right now. I'm going to rename it soon, but right now it's the Lukie Boxing Podcast. I want to rename it to Boxing with Dakota and the Big Dog because my partner in the podcast, Dakota's been having, not to put his business out there, but guys are kind of little dogging him and stuff. So I'd like to rename it so he can be a more of a central focus. So if the show picks up, he can get a more prominent position going to fights and stuff. Got the Substack, obviously Lukie Boxing. If I rename the podcast, I'll probably rename the Substack to something of that nature. The Substack has the full fight previews with knowledgeable guests. The podcast has short previews, and then I have a YouTube channel that right now, every now and then I make an exclusive video for it. But right now, really what it is you get the video of a fight preview, the big fights, that kicks you over to the Substack if you want more. and you get the live podcast on Sundays typically. So if you want to see the live podcast, if you want to get it before the 24-hour download, you can watch the podcast live. And then every blue moon, I'll make an exclusive video just for the YouTube.
Lovely. We love it. Thank you so much, Lukie, as always, for supporting, and it's been a pleasure. And thank you to everybody for listening. I hope you've enjoyed BTR Boxing Weekly this week. I know there's not a lot of sexy fights going on at the moment, but we try our best to bring some good conversations and some narratives to these fights, you know, that are not just all about the fact that these fights maybe not are appealing, but we've got some good bits of tidbit news coming in over the last few weeks, so it's good to talk about those things as well. So I do always enjoy sort of putting my opinion there and hearing what other people have to say. So thanks for bearing with us and thanks for listening, and we will be back, of course, to recap this on next week's show, along with previewing what else is coming up over the course of the next week. So that is it for this one. Thank you so much as always, and we will be back next time. Thanks for listening to the BTR Boxing Podcast Weekly.